So thanks everyone for joining. I'm Ariel Nelson with the League of Oregon Cities, and I'm your LOC lobbyist focused on all things housing, land use, and development. We really appreciate you joining us today. I wanted to share a couple technical pieces before we start, just to note, I think we're all probably Zoom pros by now, but if we're going to be have some PowerPoint slides up today, you're welcome to shift your view if that's helpful to you. Up in your top right corner, you have the option. There's a standard view with speakers' faces above it, or you can shift to side by side or gallery, up to you. Just wanted to note that. And then I would also ask that we're definitely going to be working in question and answer time and some discussion time throughout the agenda today. And so it would be really helpful if you are able to rename yourself to identify your city or your position, or at the least, if you're particularly when you're putting comments into the chat, we're going to be using the chat to gather a lot of feedback from you today. We'd love to make sure that we know where you're from and the city, and if you're a counselor or a city manager, that'd be really helpful when you put feedback into the chat. If you're already renamed, it'll do that for you. So thank you all. So those are our technical pieces. Today's webinar was really focused, it's focused on shelter and homelessness for a number of reasons. One is that I think all of you and so many of our member cities across the state are really seeing a rise in homeless rates, people experiencing homelessness, people seeking shelter and services. And we've really seen that a huge focus on that in the state legislature as well with state resources through the pandemic and with the ARPA dollars. That's a big part of the conversation as we look forward to those investments. So we wanted to take some time to share some updates from some of our really important partners that you'll hear from in just a minute. And then we have a couple bills. We have a legislative update. I'm going to share the bills that we expect to move forward, as well as spend the bulk of the time on the two bills that are bolded on the agenda, because those are actually in effect now. The governor signed those in the last couple of weeks. And we want to make sure to give you some technical information on what those bills mean, how to implement them for cities, and kind of give you some resources as you look towards implementing this. We also want to hear from you. We're going to be putting out a lot more resources over the next year and a half as we implement these other bills and other policies, other needs that you're facing around shelter and homelessness, but also housing as well, because we know that affordable housing and additional housing is the permanent solution to homelessness. And so we want to make sure that we're focusing on those needs as well. So we want to hear from you what would be helpful, what forms of resources, webinars are helpful to you, but also what specific topics. So we'll have a little poll at the end to kind of get some ideas out, get some questions, and then some time to discuss and throw some ideas, hear from you what would be helpful. And before I move on, I just also want to share, a piece of this where in the legislative update, we're going to be talking about kind of the technical, how these bills affect cities, what the requirements are on paper, but also are really hoping to hear from you. We know that a big part of solving homelessness in your communities involves some really difficult conversations at the local level. And it's also really important to include, the various members of your community. And I know many of you are having these conversations, hosting forums around the state, but that involve your residents, business community, law enforcement, people experiencing homelessness, your service provider partners. So we want to hear from you on how that's going and how we can support you in those efforts as well, because those conversations are equally as important as the technical pieces. So I want to go ahead and turn it over to a really amazing partner from the Oregon Community Foundation. Megan Loeb has been instrumental in the Project Turnkey, which the League of Oregon Cities and Association of Oregon Counties partnered on. Go ahead and share. I think many of you are familiar by now, but she can give a reminder of what Project Turnkey is all about, and also some really exciting updates about the work that they've been doing over the last few months.
Thanks, Ariel. I appreciate that. And good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for having me today. As Ariel said, I work at Oregon Community Foundation, and I'm here today for a quick update on Project Turnkey. As a quick reminder, Project Turnkey is a $65 million allocation of state general funds that came to Oregon Community Foundation to administer. And I think I have a quick slide if Julie can show it, um, just on an overview. Yeah, that's perfect right there. That's great. Thanks so much, Julie. The goal of Project Turnkey is twofold. First, to immediately acquire hotels and motels for non-congregate shelter through the pandemic, and then longer term for communities to convert those properties to transitional or permanent housing, which is much needed in our state. This model allows our state to address both the short-term need and the long-term need for affordable housing in one single investment. It's been a really busy few months here at OCF as we've been administering this competitive grant process to review and make decisions on community-centered applications through Project Turnkey. We've relied on a strong advisory committee of people from around the state to help us implement an equitable, community-driven grant process. That's been very important to us, that it has an approach that's community-centered and incredibly at the heart of it, really community-driven in terms of what each community is proposing to us as a project. In a few short months, we've awarded funds to 14 projects around the state, and you can see those represented on this map that's being shown on the screen here, for the acquisition of hotels. And we have a few more announcements in the weeks ahead that we're excited to share with you. The Whiskey Inn in Pendleton is now the Promise Inn, and a hotel in Salem for survivors of domestic violence is called Mosaic, a really beautiful symbolic name about the creation of something beautiful from broken pieces. In Eugene, the Red Lion is now the Owl Creek Crossing, housing fire survivors from the Holiday Farm fire. And in Redmond, I saw somebody from Redmond on the call. The Bethlehem Inn is just getting up and running to provide housing to people experiencing housing insecurity in Central Oregon. Each of these properties is serving the unique needs of its community. Our program right now is in its final weeks of implementation, but we anticipate reaching our goal. Our goal was 800 to 1,000 units of shelter and housing in about 18 projects around the state. It's been a collaborative effort, and I want to thank LOC and AOC for their incredible leadership on this effort, not just in the initial inception, but all the way through implementation over the many months that have been a lot of heavy lifting and a lot of hard work, but they have been at the table the entire time. And we've seen an incredible support as well from cities on these projects. In some cases, that support is financial. For example, in Medford, the city has partnered with a local nonprofit organization to augment the Project Turnkey funds for property acquisition with CDBG funds so that they can add kitchenettes to the units to support fire survivors through interim housing. In some cases, city support has been through leadership, such as in Forest Grove, where the city offered encouragement, support through their community development office, and partnerships at the local level, including support from their neighboring community of Cornelius, which has been a champion for this project. In all cases, local support is a key factor in consideration of an award for a project. Even with the new streamlined zoning bills, projects that don't have strong local support have not been successful through our application process. These really are community-centered projects at their core. We look forward to and are currently preparing a retrospective report on this Project Turnkey initiative for the legislature, and that will be available in July on our website. If you're interested in following our progress and learning a little bit more about how it's gone, what some of the key successes, early outcomes, and obstacles have been through the process, I would invite you to go to our website in July and look for that report. But we're really excited about this historic investment in both shelter infrastructure and also in long-term affordable housing units in our state over just a few short months. So I'll pause there for questions.
Feel free to put questions in the chat, or I see that we have a hand raised from Jeannie Adams and Rodney Shanks. Not sure if that was on purpose, but you're welcome to unmute yourself and share a question. Let's go to Tiger City Councilor. I can't see your full name, Jeanette. Sorry, it's cut off on my screen.
Jeanette Shaw.
Councilor Shaw, thank you.
Thank you, Ariel. Hello, Megan. We're former colleagues from another world. I'm a new counselor, so I apologize. I think this is a great project. Is this 65 million? Is this a one-time legislative dollars that have been assigned, or is this going to be ongoing for a number of years?
Jeanette, it's so wonderful to see you. I should say, Councilor Shaw. It's wonderful to see you in this new world. We worked together, over a decade ago in another world, and so it's really wonderful to cross paths with you again. This is a one-time allocation of state general funds. We anticipate it to be just a one-time effort, and are excited about the traction. I will mention that we have had outreach at the federal level because we are one of 2 states to have done this at a statewide scale. And we are going to be part of a case study that's being put out by the National Alliance to End Homelessness, sharing some of the early outcomes of our process as home guidance is released at the federal level for home HUD funds.
Thank you.
Great question. And I don't know if Megan would share this as well, but Project Turnkey has been cited in a number of media coverage and national news articles about homelessness and innovative strategies and solutions. And so while it is one-time funding, I think that we're going to see, the larger funding that comes for the state through urban housing community services, federal funding. We may see other opportunities in future funding for similar projects like this. Any other questions for Megan on Project Turnkey? Or also feel free to add them to the chat later on if you think of something. I'm sure we'll come back to this as so much of our agenda today is pretty interrelated.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Rich Mays, City of the Dalles. Did I understand you to say that public support is a criteria for the awarding of funds? How do you measure that kind of thing?
Hello, Rich. Thanks so much for the question. In our criteria, one of the key factors is broad community support of the project, and that can look really different depending upon the proposal and the community. We looked at community support as financial contributions, as letters of support, as indications of supportive partnerships, helpfulness in terms of zoning and city planning and land use. It took a lot of forms. We also wanted to see strong connections to supportive services in the community and wraparound supports, connections to culturally specific providers if the applicant was not a culturally specific provider themselves. So it was one of a number of criteria that were used in our review process for all applications received.
Thank you very much.
Good question. I will also add that our LOC director, Mike Coley, as well as the AOC director, Gina Nichols, were both on the steering committee that was helping advise Oregon Community Foundation, helping making the decisions on awards for these and which projects would move forward in the process. And part of their participation was looking for that local involvement, looking for the coordination with the applicable city and county to ensure that the shelter provider was indeed working with their community. So that was definitely an important part of the process. I see a question for the website. I'm sure we can get that into the chat for Oregon Community Foundation. As Megan said, there'll be a full report in July, but you can see, I think there's some brief information up there now for the Project Turnkey website. The application has closed as they're making the final decisions on funding. That answers that question. Anything else on Project Turnkey? Great. All right. Well, feel free to, again, follow up with questions in the chat or via email after this. We'll be sure to follow up with you. But I'm going to go ahead and move on to our next slide. We're going to go into a bit of a legislative update on some key bills that LSC, that I've been specifically working on this session, and that have some direct impacts to cities. Great. So let me just get my windows rearranged here. Okay. So I'm going to, I think we need to go back a couple slides, Julie, if you don't mind. There should be one, or maybe need to go back through 2 or 3. If we can. The first bill we're going to talk about today and spend the bulk of our time on is House Bill 2006, which is a bill related to emergency shelter siting. Julie, could you back up a little bit on the PowerPoint if possible? This PowerPoint will be available on the website as well as the recording, so you'll have access to that. Perfect. There we go. So Governor Brown signed House Bill 2006 into law on Wednesday the 12th, so very recently, and it takes effect immediately. And what it does is it requires local governments to approve an application for an emergency shelter, regardless of any state or local land use laws, if that shelter meets some specific criteria that are outlined in the bill. So in other words, a city can't deny an application to develop an emergency shelter or operate one if that application complies with the bill, even if your city's land use code would normally prohibit that shelter at that location. Next slide, please. And so I've just bulleted out some of the kind of more technical pieces of the bill. This just confirming this is not a land use decision. So there's no mailed notice, no public hearing as you would normally do for a siting application. There's no time period prescribed. And also shelters approved or denied by a city under this cannot be appealed to LUBA, to the Land Use Board of Appeals. Instead, the bill does give an appeal process, but it's through a writ of review process that it's outlined in statute that instead goes to circuit court. And then the effective dates, as I said, the bill went into effect immediately upon signing by the governor. But importantly to note is that the bill does sunset on July 1st, 2022, so just about a year. So what that means is that cities, this bill applies and cities have to approve qualifying applications if they're completed and submitted between the 12th of May and July 2022. Once the bill sunsets, if the legislature hasn't renewed it, any shelter that's been approved under the bill gets to remain in perpetuity. But so that part doesn't sunset. The sunset. The shelter gets to stay permanent. And regardless of whether the bill is in effect or not, if a city approves a shelter under this bill, and then the shelter ceases to operate, then the regular land use regulations do apply again. Next slide, please. So here I've just bulleted what those shelter requirements are under the bill to qualify. So cities have to approve an emergency shelter if it has to provide sleeping and restroom facilities. Cities do get to still apply applicable building codes. So that's important to note. It has to be located within the UGB or in a rural residential zone. There's some language in here that the Department of Land Conservation Development added where it says that it can't result there. They want to be sure that shelters aren't being approved and sited in areas designated like a tsunami inundation zone or floodplains or related to natural hazards unless the development is able to comply with proper regulations directly related to that hazard. So if you're a coastal community and this is a tsunami inundation zone, this doesn't say you can't have a shelter, but it says that you're going to have to comply with whatever regulations the city is going to ask for in order for people to be safe there, for the structure to be safe. It requires adequate transportation access to commercial and medical services, and it can't pose any unreasonable risk to public health or safety. And those when our city planners are looking at that, this can seem kind of vague and it's not as specific as we're used to seeing in kind of land use law. And that's because city planners did not write this bill, the legislature did. And so you do have a little bit, this is a place where you're going to want to consult with your city attorney, with your council, so that you're comfortable with what you're looking for with that. But I will share that the adequate transportation access to commercial and medical services, the legislative intent behind that, as we understand it, is and was negotiated is that, we didn't want to see shelters being approved out in the middle of nowhere where folks were trapped, couldn't get into town, couldn't get to their doctor's appointments. So rather than require it be on transit, because not every community has regular transit, the thought was that it might be appropriate for a shelter to be sited, kind of in the middle of nowhere if they're providing regular shuttles for people to get to services to get into town, those kinds of things. And then there's some requirements around who the shelter must be operated by. So it either has to be operated by a local government or an organization that's a housing authority, a religious institution, an established nonprofit that has at least 2 years experience operating an emergency shelter using best practices. However, they didn't want to close the door completely on new organizations because we know that there are not enough providers in all parts of the state. So if you are a nonprofit corporation that doesn't have 2 years of experience, if you're partnering with an experienced provider who's kind of, helping you, sponsoring you, then you could qualify. So that's a place where cities are going to be looking, where you're going to have some discretion to kind of determine if it meets that. So next slide, please. There's some permissive pieces in House Bill 2006. This lists the things that an emergency shelter may provide on site and at no cost, but it's not a requirement to get approved through this bill. These shelters may include youth shelters, veterans shelters. It can be a seasonal winter warming shelter, day shelter. It also allows an emergency shelter to provide additional transitional housing services at a specified fee. Next slide, please. And then it also adds some flexibilities that are optional for local governments, where a political subdivision may allow any public or private entity to allow or basically set up an overnight camping program for homeless individuals living in vehicles on the property of that entity. And it allows cities to impose reasonable conditions on those offering those camping spaces. And if a city is going to set up something up and sanction something like this, then the entities, the bigger main requirement under this law is that entities who are providing these camping spaces are going to have to provide access to sanitary facilities, including toilets, hand washing, and trash disposal. So before this piece in the bill, there was a cap, I think, on the amount of vehicles that a local government could authorize. So this puts this solely in your control. This is something that many communities are pursuing and looking at as we're looking for people to stay and be without, with some stability in partnership with service providers to, again, connect them to services, connect them to housing, and ensure that any vehicle camping designated areas are being, appropriately serviced by trash disposal, sanitation for folks there. And yes, we will send the PowerPoint out to everyone registered, and it will also be on our website. So there are going to be a lot of links in here. We do want you to be able to use this as a resource, so you will definitely have access to this. Next slide, please, Julie. All right, so some of the good news is that some of you may remember or be familiar with House Bill 4212, which was a big omnibus bill during one of the special sessions this last summer, fall. But a piece of that was they passed an earlier version of this bill. And so we have a handful of cities who have experience operating this. So here I have linked, the city of Eugene actually set up a website for their process. And they really lay out a really clear description of what the bill does. I will note, though, that it is, the website they have up right now is for 4212. So there's a couple things that will get updated, and you'll want to rely on, make sure anything you set up, you're going to want to rely on the text of House Bill 2006. And the city of Eugene actually reviewed and approved 7 applications, and they've posted those, both the applications and their approval letters. So you can see an example of how Eugene set up their process that I think would be really useful for cities looking at how they're going to implement 2006. And it's a little small here, but the city of Eugene, they didn't create a physical application for this process. They just said that to submit an emergency shelters, they call it super siting application, that an applicant must provide the city with a letter or a narrative and supporting evidence demonstrating how the proposed shelter meets the criteria listed in the bill. And then their website goes on to list out those criteria very clearly. They strongly encourage applicants to connect with planning staff prior to submitting an application, and they encourage them to set up a consultation ahead of time. So that's one example, and I really encourage you to follow that link and head to their site to see that example. I will say one key difference, we got a few technical improvements into this version of the bill in House Bill 2006 from the early version. One key difference is the early bill talked about when it defined what a shelter is, an emergency shelter, defined it as a structure, a single structure. And we know that so many communities pursued non-congregate shelter and did things like pallet structures and tiny homes during the pandemic. We wanted to make sure it was clear that multiple structures could be allowed. So that's a key difference that we had in the bill this session of several. Can you do the next slide, Julie? And I see people are sharing program information in the chat. We love seeing great examples. We're gonna, one of the other things we're gonna do is build up on the LOC website under our A to Z topics. We're gonna start to really flesh out the housing section. We'll have a section specifically on this and on shelter programs. And we would love to get your great examples that we can link to and show so that other cities can look at other examples and what might work for them if they're interested in pursuing these. So here's a snapshot of the application that Ben put together. It's a simple 2-page Word document, kind of a check the box situation. You know, they ask you to talk about what your, describe your entity, you know, when you plan to open the shelter, do you have a building permit application? You know, is this new construction? You know, not all of these questions are required in the bill, but it's a way for the city to get information on, you know, the kinds of supports and kinds of oversight they're going to want to see on this property. One of the pieces that isn't included in the bill is accessibility, ADA compliance. It's not required in the bill. But I know that's something that many of the cities who did this wanted to encourage. So you definitely have an opportunity to work with the shelter applicants in this situation to say, hey, have you thought about ADA compliance? How can we work with you to make that happen, kind of a thing. Again, it's not going to keep you from denying an application under this law, but it's certainly something that you can work to encourage. In this application, at Ben, they have them self-certifying, you know, the public health and safety piece of the bill, you know, Ben's asking for acknowledgement from the fire department that, you know, emergency vehicles can safely access the site. I mean, these are all things that you can include in your requirements. They've also asked for a diagram of the facility. So, you know, Eugene referenced that as supporting documentation. These are just wanted to share these as examples. And Julie, if you can do the next slide, we'll see an example approval letter. So it's pretty simple. It's a conditional letter of approval, which is conditional on the applicant getting all the building permits. So this is kind of what they were issuing as the yes, you can go forward. But ultimately the city has the say. If it's, you know, if it doesn't comply with building codes, obviously they're not going to get the green light for that. So I want to pause here before we move on much further and see if we can take some questions or comments. I'm going to start with the chat and then we'll move to folks that have their hands raised. So the question I see first is, under the bill, are pallet shelters allowed? And they are in that, you know, we changed the bill so it allows multiple structures. Now it says they must comply with the applicable building code. So that's something that you're going to want to work out at the local level with your building official and see, you know, how to make that work. I know that multiple cities and communities are pursuing pallet shelters and have made that work under their code. So I don't have the expertise or the information for you on specifically how to do that, but I'm happy to help you connect with folks that have. And with folks that have gone down that path, that's a great question. But my understanding is there have been communities that made that work under the bill. The House Bill 2006 really just speaks to the zoning and the siting. Building code is still very much a city process. So I think you have the discretion to go down that path and make that work. Let's see. Let's go ahead and go to Dan Cummings from the City of Ontario has a hand raised. Feel free to unmute yourself.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Thank you. Yeah. Stan Cummings, Community Development Director from City of Ontario. Have the Mayor, Mr. Riley Hill here. My main question on this, on the previous bill's law changes, when it dealt with camps, meaning, tents and camps and stuff that does not meet the building codes, the communities were restricted to just 2 sites. Has that been changed? Because now it sounds like we got to allow these camps anywhere they want to be. So before we were limited, and I didn't see that change in there in the building codes that reduce that from restricted us to 2 sites when it comes to campsites.
Yeah, that's a really great question. So this bill is all about specifically emergency shelters. So campsites and any number of tents wouldn't necessarily qualify as an emergency shelter. This has to be an established shelter with facilities operated by an experienced provider. So this should not change existing law on how many campsites and where and when a city allows or doesn't allow. That we do have other legislation that we'll touch on that, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But in terms of informal campsites, this bill doesn't govern that. So I hope that helps.
Thank you.
You bet. And then there's a question in the chat. What about considerations regarding screening of those seeking to use a shelter, pets, background checks, family safety? So those are, this bill's kind of silent to that. That's really something that's going to be in the purview of the shelter operator, the shelter provider. One of the resources we want to make sure that we connect you with is there's definitely guidance on shelter best practices, providing shelter that's low barrier to the people that are experiencing homelessness in your community. And there's also fair housing guides and considerations to think about when providers are offering shelter. Unless you, the city, are the provider, that's really going to be more left to the service provider. At the same time, and again, you're going to want to consult with your city attorney on this, but in as much as that cities have the discretion to have the ability to confirm that these shelters aren't going to pose a public safety risk or health and safety risk to those residents at that shelter, I think that, there's, potentially the opportunity for you to review or request an operations plan and hear from the provider, what their plans are about screening and how that works. I don't know that you're going to have a lot of authority under this bill to govern that a lot, but certainly if there was a real risk here and, you felt, if the city felt that the provider was not well equipped and was, going to be offering shelter under a plan that was going to put people at risk who were coming into the shelter, that would be something, again, working with your attorney that you might have some room to work on and to guide. So some great updates from Philomath in Benton County, some great partnerships to purchase a hotel there, how important community engagement was. And thanks to Mark Weinstein from City of Salem attorney, the campsite limitation was, thanks for that reminder, was made in 2019. And thank you, Meg from Fair Housing. The link to Fair Housing Council of Oregon is in the chat, and there's resources there, and we will be putting those up on our website as well, so you can read more about those there, as well as a PDF from Fair Housing. Thank you. All right, any more questions at this stage? This was really the technical piece of the bill, and we'll go into one more bill before, and then we'll do some more questions from there. So feel free to ask any technical questions. And we'll, I'm available, and we can continue to have these conversations as cities encounter and start to implement more of this. I will note the cities that I'm aware of that did review and approve shelter applications were Eugene, as I mentioned, and again, check out their website. I think it's a really great resource. Bend, and we'll put those examples up on the website. The city of Hood River also cited, I think, approved 2 shelters, or at least 1 shelter. And I believe one of those was using pallet structures. So you may want to reach out to your colleagues in the planning and building departments there to kind of hear how that went. Salem and Portland also approved shelters under the original bill, and that was only in effect for 90 days. So one of the things those communities experienced is there was a big rush where applicants were getting their shelter applications in right before the deadline. And then it took cities, some time to go through and do the due diligence and process those. The good thing about House Bill 2006 is it's in effect for a year. So we shouldn't see that rush. It should be more spread out. But I think that, what I heard from the cities, from the planners and the staff that implemented this is that, encouraging, you're going to have to do some work with the applicants. And so the more that you have those relationships with your shelter providers and your service providers ahead of time to know, it'll make it easier for them to submit an application that's easier for a city to review and apply the bill. All right, so I'm not seeing additional questions unless, Julie, feel free to chime in if I missed something, or raise your hand if I missed your question in the chat. But otherwise, Julie, if you don't mind going to the next slide on House Bill 3261. Thank you. And I apologize. I'll fix the PowerPoint. I think we have I have the numbers reversed at the top, but House Bill 3261 was also just recently signed into law on the 6th and is now in effect. And this is kind of a similar bill in its motivation and what it's trying to do. It's a little bit technically different. The bill's more simply written maybe, but it requires local governments to allow the conversion of hotels and motels into either an emergency shelter or affordable housing, regardless of any state or local land use laws. And again, the application has to meet specific approval criteria. And this one is just much more limited in that it only applies to hotel or motel properties. So it has to be, and these properties have to be within a UGB. They can't be located in a heavy industrial zone. They have to have adequate transportation access to commercial and medical services. It's similar language and intent to the other bill. And similarly, not within, if it's in an area related to natural disasters or hazards, it needs to comply with regulations related to those disasters or hazards. Building codes still apply, occupancy limits, and cities may also apply reasonable siting and design standards, but that's only so long as the standards do not individually or cumulatively prohibit the conversion through unreasonable cost or delay. So if you find yourself in that situation, that's again where you're going to want to work with your planning staff and your city attorney to determine, what kind of siting and design standards you'd be wanting to put on this. And this bill applies to hotel or motel conversions or applications for conversions submitted on or after January 1st, 2021. So it has a bit of a look back. So if you have a property, a hotel property that was maybe a project turnkey project or doing a similar model, but with other funding, so not technically project turnkey, and they were going through your zoning process, now that this bill's in effect, they can simply apply through, you're probably going to want to set up a system or require a letter, some documentation from them. But they get to do that without going through the regular land use notice and appeal, or you can't require a rezone or a conditional use permit for them to take a hotel property and convert that to either shelter or affordable housing. So, and this bill was brought by Representative Marsh from Southern Oregon, who was a very strong champion for the resources for Project Turnkey. And she was working with Project Turnkey and the folks working on those projects who, the funding, the nature of the funding was very quick. The need was very emergent, particularly with, folks displaced from the wildfire and during COVID. And so she really wanted to find a way to streamline specifically those projects that were converting, because there were some that going through the regular process that was, that is required, was going to potentially jeopardize their ability to get funding and to house people. So that's really it about that bill. It's brand new. We don't have examples from before, but I think we have a lot of those good examples from House Bill 2006 or from the earlier version can be applied here. This bill does not sunset like 2006. It is ongoing. So if someone wants to convert a motel property in the future, they can. The other piece about this bill is while the I'll use Project Turnkey as an example, these hotels right now in the near term are being converted to shelter, but a community may decide that they want to keep that as shelter. They may want to turn it into transitional housing, or they may decide to turn it into permanent affordable units, add kitchens, make them fully contained units. And so in that case, you may have a property that's, converted once to shelter, and in a few years after it gets potentially some affordable housing development conversion dollars, potentially from OHCS, from the state, they would also similarly not have to go through a rezone or conditional use process in order to convert to affordable housing. Let's get my chat up. And this wants to know, the other question is, do challenges go to the circuit court and not LUBA? Let me double check on that. I don't have that. I'm going to pull the bill up so I can double check, because I can't remember off the top of my head. I don't think that, I'm going to look at it again, and I know that we've got some good attorneys on this call, so correct me if I'm wrong, but I am not seeing a reference that it does not go to LUBA, although I think, does it say it's not? Yeah, I don't think that it doesn't say anything about going through the writ process instead of through LUBA. So that is a difference between this bill and 2006. And thanks, Mark, for updating the question about the campsite limitation. The bill from 2019 that removed that limitation on number of tents was House Bill 2916. But I don't believe there was anything prescriptive about that for local governments. It was just more an allowance. All right. So any questions on this bill? I'm not seeing any hand raised, and I think we've been through the chat. Great. So before we move on to the next, or actually, no, I think we'll go ahead and move on to the next slide, Julie, if you don't mind. So the next two bills have not passed the legislature yet. They are still in the process. I think some of you know quite a bit about these, or have at least heard about them. And so I just wanted to kind of share where they're at. And the big, so I'll start with House Bill 3115. That is related to local ordinances regulating homelessness. And this is a bill that the LOC is supporting in partnership with the Oregon Law Center, which is an organization that our members and the LOC is not always on the same page with. This bill really started well ahead of session. Speaker Kotek, who was the champion of the shelter siting bill and has brought a lot of recent legislation to further, housing goals, but that also, brings some new requirements and restrictions on local government and on cities. So the speaker, basically directed and asked local government and the Oregon Law Center to form a work group. Her goal was she wanted to affirm the Martin v. Boise federal decision. She wanted the state statute version of that. And we decided early on in that work group that we were not going to, quote, codify or directly mirror that decision in state statute. There was, as I think folks know, there was a lot of ambiguities in that holding that decision, a lot of difficulties for implementation for cities. And so the work group that met, which included the League of Cities, individual cities and counties, representatives from law enforcement, from the Association of Oregon Counties, some other housing advocate providers, really wanted to work on something that was going to be implementable. That was our main goal for anything that came out of this, is we wanted a standard that wasn't going to force a statewide solution that wasn't going to fit for all communities. So we instead instilled a core principle. The bill that's resulted 3115 takes a core principle from the case, which is that it requires any city or county law regulating the acts of sitting, lying, sleeping, or keeping warm and dry outside on public property, that it must be, if you have a law that regulates these activities, it must be objectively reasonable, based on the totality of the circumstances, as applied to all stakeholders, including persons experiencing homelessness. So it's a pretty broad template. It preserves the ability of cities to manage public spaces. So it doesn't say you can't, it doesn't say, it still lets cities, enforce those laws. It still lets them have laws regulating those activities. I want to be clear that this bill is not a right to rest bill. There was another bill this session, House Bill 2367, that's made the news around the state that would have required cities to allow camping everywhere, essentially. That bill did not pass. We did not support that bill. It is not moving forward this session. So I just want to be really clear about that. We really promoted this bill as a much more reasonable alternative. And it recognizes that what's going to be objectively reasonable in terms of your ordinances, whether a specific ban in this place or at this time is reasonable is going to depend on your local community, and the local stakeholders involved. So that's something that will go through the court. So that's the template that this bill sets out, and really tries to set out. A key piece of the bill that we negotiated, and the key thing I want to share with you today, is that it's still there's a delayed operability date, I should probably say, for cities. So the bill has an emergency clause, but cities don't have to come into compliance with this until July 1st of 2023. And the LOC is very much planning to, if this bill passes, to put out a range of resources with your communities. And we'll talk a little bit more about that today, about what that could look like. But we want to make sure that cities are supported in implementing this, and our partners at the Oregon Law Center have agreed to be a part of that and help with putting out guidance. I don't know that we're going to get to a model ordinance, because I think that ordinances are going to be, something that's going to be specific to each local community. But we want to support you in that on the technical side. And also, as I've talked about, part of this process and part of the intent with delaying the implementation date is we want to ensure that cities are having conversations with your key stakeholders. How is law enforcement involved in this? Make sure that you're working with advocates, with people, your service provider partners, people operating shelters, people with lived experience of homelessness, so that your ordinance, so that you have strong public conversations, and the goal being that results in ordinance updates that won't be challenged, because you've worked with your community and you've worked with your partners to talk about what is reasonable for your community, to both manage public space and serve people who have nowhere else to go and are living on the street. So that's what's going on with that bill. Let me check and see if there's any. I see some more questions about conversions and shelters, so we can circle back to that in a bit. But let me know if you have any specific questions on this bill. And I'm going to go ahead and go to the next slide, and we'll do questions after that if we see more pop up. I see Mayor Traber, did you have a quick question before we move on to the next bill?
Yes, I did. It had to do with the guidance coming out, and I know our discussions locally on the things related to House Bill 3115 was distinguishing between camping and resting, where part of that had to do with the extent of the camp that someone had set up, like how much stuff was there, how many tarps and tents and all of that for an individual, versus the ability to sleep and stay dry. And so that is permitted by this bill, but camping with the whole camp set up in a longer term situation was not. So I don't know how that fits into here. I'm far from a legal expert, but that's one of those that has been raised locally by our attorneys, making that distinction. So someone can come back and sleep in the same spot every night, but then take it down and go away and then come back and sleep in that spot. That's permitted, but leaving that up permanently with their stuff left there and the like is not permitted. So
yeah, that's a really important question. The bill does talk about keeping warm and dry, but it doesn't, part of the work group negotiations where it doesn't necessarily permit tents or structures, right? And it may be that at different times of the year, different types of camping are more appropriate or more reasonable, whether it's, freezing outside, snowing, cold, that kind of a thing. And so that is something that we'll want to make sure to dig in. You're having those conversations, and that's where you're really going to want to consult with your city attorney. But we certainly want to help support those conversations and help cities think thoughtfully about that. So we'll absolutely be kind of diving into that in more detail.
Okay, thank you.
But so real quick, I'm going to talk about another bill, House Bill 3124A is currently still in the process. This amends some existing statute around that governs how and when cities remove campsites, sometimes called sweeps. The current law right now is that you have to give 24 hours written posted notice before you remove a campsite, unless there's, an emergency. So the main thing that this bill does in impacting cities is that it extends that posting requirement to 72 hours. It retains and preserves exceptions to the notice. If law enforcement believe that there's illegal activities other than potential illegal camping, or if there's an exceptional emergency, including but not limited to site contamination by hazardous materials, public health emergency, immediate danger to human life or safety. So it's really that posting notice that's changing. The other piece that's different, that's new in this bill, if it passes, is that current law requires jurisdictions to store any unclaimed property for 30 days. That it remains the same. They had originally wanted to do 90 days, and we got that removed because that was just not going to be something that most jurisdictions could afford to provide. And we also know around the state that the majority of unclaimed property, folks come to get that within the first week or so, and it's very rare that property kept longer actually gets collected. But the bill would require jurisdiction to store unclaimed property in a facility located in the same community as the camping site from which it was removed. That is a little vague, so you have a little room there. Again, consult with your attorney, but our understanding from our members and from our partners who worked on this bill is that that's mostly the practice. It's typically state agencies that may be storing property really far away, and when it comes to parks and to local governments, they're not being stored somewhere else. So that's just wanted you to be aware of that bill and what it does and doesn't do. So I want to do a time check. I want to make sure we save some time for our next presenter, but I do see a few questions in the chat. So we've got an attorney chiming in, thank you. Conversions from hotel motels to emergency shelters in the bill is not a land use decision. I thought that was in there. So it's not under the jurisdiction of LUBA. So it doesn't explicitly say it in the same way the other bill does, but it's not going to go to LUBA. It's not a land use decision. Thank you for that, Jonathan. And then there's a question, will shelters or car camping be allowed to charge for any services? I will say that, best practices for shelters is you're not charging for services. And so that House Bill 2006 does have this allowance that a shelter may charge for a certain amount for transitional housing. Because we know I think that was put in the request, there are some programs that start to move folks, once they're beyond the emergency shelter stage, they may move them into a transitional program where they are charging a nominal amount for rent to get them on track, as they have employment and as they're working. But I think it's going to depend on the provider and on the program. However, that's where you're going to want to check with your providers. Look at guiding fair housing guidance on and best practices on low barrier shelters. The majority of folks in emergency shelters don't have the resources for housing. And so most of those are offered free of charge. Really good question that I probably don't have a solid answer to, not as an attorney here, is conversion of a hotel to shelter or affordable housing considered needed housing and subject only to clear and objective standards? Probably, again, there's that piece in the bill, and this is where you're going to want to talk to your attorney, but it's a great question. There's that clause in the bill about, and I don't have the slide in front of me anymore. Oh, I've got the bill though. That talks about you can do some siding and design, but it can't be, where did it go? it can't significantly impact, it can't, the standards cannot individually or cumulatively prohibit the conversion through unreasonable cost or delay. So you're gonna have to put that lens on it. You know, these for the most part are established structures, established buildings. I think the intent behind this is that, you know, that they're for the most part, they're going to be in the same footprint. And so where this is going to come in if someone is maybe trying to add units or do something there. And I think the intent was to allow the city to have some discretion, but that's maybe something that we'll want our city attorneys to kind of circle around and maybe come to dig into that, and we can maybe put out some further information on that after some experts have had some time to weigh in on that, but we can definitely flag that for follow-up. We have a question. Many campers hoard furniture and other things that they have appropriated from public dumping, but may not be personal belongings. Would these items also have to be stored for 30 days? So yeah, that's the current law kind of already covers. This is already required in the current law. I think the language has something about, you know, it kind of puts the local government in the position of determining what is property of value, what is personal property. And we know from advocates that you know, discernment, that decision doesn't always get made the way that people who have left or experiencing homelessness would like. And so, you know, the bill only requires personal property. Certainly it doesn't require, and the law doesn't require cities to keep trash. It also allows them to give any illegal substances to or firearms to law enforcement. It allows them to donate things if they remain unclaimed. That's something you're going to want to check with your city attorney. And you know, this is one of the places where we want to, you know, maybe this is something where cities could use some guidance on like what are best practices, how are cities deciding what to store, what not to store. And we've also, you know, had some questions or some suggestions, like how can we have conversations about ways to move away from sweeps, not because we're never going to do them or that there's never a time where our campsite's not going to be removed, but you know, as cities are partnering and as we are seeing more shelter and services offered in communities, you know, maybe in day shelters, navigation centers, there can be more places for people to store their belongings. There can be more certainty for people on where they, you know, under 3115, one of the goals is that there would be more certainty and transparency about where people are and aren't camping, so that cities would be removing less campsites. And so it would be less of, you know, we would see less of these situations where our cities are put in difficult positions of trying to figure out, you know, what is personal property. We've got a great city attorney answer about the conversion and clear and objective standard, our question. So yeah, Eric says, if the clear objective standard for needed housing is part of land use and House Bill 3261 exempts conversion from land use, wouldn't it necessarily exempt the standard? Probably. I'm not the attorney to decide that for you. That is your city attorney. But we can definitely kind of pull some folks together and see if we can come to an agreement and get some answers out from the league. But I got to check with my attorney as well. I'm not going to give you a solid answer to that today, but this is really helpful. Please continue to bring these questions. This is what we want to try and hear from you. You know, where do you need help and guidance? So thank you for that. All right. So keep the questions coming. They are really great. I want to go ahead and move on to our next presenter. We have Connor McDonald, who, if you've been on a webinar on housing before, you may have met before. You may have met him through his role as a housing integrator at Oregon Housing and Community Services. That's our state agency for affordable housing, finance, and services. Connor has a lot of slides, but he's not going to be presenting. We have a bunch of slides from him with a lot of great resources and links that he's going to kind of give a high level overview, but they're really there as resources for you to go back to and dig into. So want to make sure that you have connections to those, and definitely we'll have some time for question with Connor as well. So if you're on, Connor, feel free to, I don't know if I, feel free to go. I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Happy Friday, everybody. As Ariel said, my name is Connor McDonald. I work as a housing integrator at Oregon Housing Community Services. And so we're the state housing finance agency, as she said, and our mission is to provide stable and affordable housing through programs that address poverty and provide opportunity for Oregonians. If you could bring the slides up, that would be great. Are they up? I don't see them. Thank you.
Thanks, Julie.
Yeah, next slide. Yeah, great. So this is a lot of what we do is really provide resources to local organizations. So both federal and state resources that pass through our agency to service partners. It's really great. We work a lot with cities and with our partners as well. So just wanted to show this diagram. If you could go to the next slide. And so these are some of the agencies that you all that are probably already working in partnership with. But just wanted to make sure that you had some information here as well. So this is the array of community action agency partners who provide anti-poverty, homeless prevention, weatherization, energy assistance programs. And they each provide really a unique role in their community and provide different services depending on community needs. And so just wanted to make sure that you all also had the link to the community action agency in your area. Next slide, please. And then also, so continuums of care are essentially like, oftentimes they're made up of the community action agency, but these are really the federal designated organizations that receive HUD resources for homeless services. And so one of the things that Ariel also asked is to make sure to share with you some of the different data points related to people experiencing homelessness, so that as you all are looking for information related to the need in your community, then you also have a way to do that. So on the COCs is what we call them, the contact information for those continuums of care on the slide. And then as well on our webpage, there's more information there. And so some of the responsibilities is tracking different program information for people experiencing homelessness through homeless management and information software, or HMIS. And then also every 2 years, there's a requirement for a sheltered and unsheltered point in time count, which is done in January every year. And then as well, they do a housing inventory count as well. And so that information you can find through the OHCS web page. You can also find it on the HUD webpage as well. Next slide, please. Also, another really important partner for you all are housing authorities. So housing authorities are essentially contractors of the federal government through HUD, and then also do housing development, which oftentimes they come through OHCS for housing capital to build new projects. And then they also distribute lots of rental assistance, federal resources, and sometimes state and local resources as well. And they also manage a lot of relationships with landlords as well as housing. So there's a link there where you can look up the contact information for the housing authority in your given area. As many of you know, in some areas, it's really embedded in the county government. Other times it's a quasi-governmental agency. And also in Marion County, for example, there's the city of Salem has a housing authority. And then there's also the county for the balance of state in that area also provides services. Next slide, please. And so as I mentioned earlier, so it's really important to kind of demonstrate the need. We know that there's a huge housing crisis across the state. And so definitely as you all embark in the work that you've already done and work in the future, it's always good to sort of know where some of the data is available that you can get. And so on the Oregon Housing Community Services website, our data team has put together a dashboard for the 2019 point in time count. And then also the continuum of care, there's data and different reports that you can also find for that multi-county area as well. And then also the Department of Education also works with all of the school districts, and each school district has a McKinney-Vento liaison who works with families that are experiencing homelessness. And there's a lot of data that's done on an annual basis and lots of other good information on their webpage as well. It's also really difficult data to look at as well, because you'll see how high the numbers are for Oregon families. Next page. Okay, and then also just at Portland State University, they have a homeless research and action collaborative. And so they've been doing a lot of research over the last couple of years. And so just wanted to make sure that you all were aware of what they were doing and some of the different reports that they've put out. And so that could just be a good place to cite information and look for and find different things that may be of interest. Also, the Oregon Department of Human Services, they have a small homeless youth team that's within their self-sufficiency office, and they are doing a statewide homeless youth needs assessment. And so they're working with a subcontractor to put that out. And really, they're trying to kind of model what the need is currently, and then also think about what future resources are needed to address the need as well. And so there's a lot of good information there, and they're also setting up kind of different regional teams, which includes the voice of youth that are experiencing homelessness or have experienced homelessness in the past. And so that's just really wanted to let you all know about that work that's happening. Great, and next slide. And so this is, I also wanted to let you all know in 2019, in August of 2019, so this is pre-pandemic, but there was a statewide shelter study that was conducted. And so just wanted to make sure that you all were aware of that. And as you'll see from that, they're about less than 65% of people experiencing homelessness live in unsheltered conditions. And so that makes Oregon one of the highest in the whole country as far as those that are unsheltered versus those that are sheltered. And so folks that are sheltered would include those that are staying in a homeless shelter, as well as are in transitional housing. And so transitional housing is generally meant, is people generally think of transitional housing as a housing program where someone can stay there for up to 2 years. And so that's really like site-based. Sometimes folks get how the length of the rental assistance and how long someone may be receiving rental assistance. They may think of it as a transitional program, but generally in the homeless services world, we think of if someone's in transitional housing as being based on how long they are allowed to live in a particular unit. Also, transitional housing plays a really important role, but it's also generally thought of that it's best to get someone into permanent housing as quickly as possible and then wrap services around that person that they may need. And so sometimes from the federal level, there's not as many resources for transitional housing because the push is really to build as much affordable housing as possible. And then also just wanted to say that shelter and affordable housing, as Ariel spoke about at the beginning of the presentation, is really important infrastructure for housing stability. And so while we know that shelter is really not the solution for homelessness, it's definitely a step up for people rather than having to literally sleep outside. And so a lot of times shelter provides a space for people to rest their head and then get wraparound services. And so we know that a lot of the good work, for example, that the Oregon Community Foundation is doing with you all with Project Turnkey, there's also a lot of services that are being provided and folks will be transitioning into affordable housing, which is really the end goal for people to secure stable housing. There's also lots of research and studies out there that just shows really poor outcomes for people that are living outside. I think that probably goes without saying as well, that it's really hard to take care of your medical issues if you don't have shelter as well or a place to stay. So next slide, please. Great, so this is the 2019 point in time count. So this would have been done in January of 2019. There is the 2020 point in time count, which would have been done in January 2020, which obviously would have been pre-pandemic. Those numbers are out as well. And so they're a little bit better than the 2019, but I would anticipate with the pandemic that those numbers probably went down. But this is the 2019 numbers. And while they do fluctuate sort of from year to year, I think the overall trend has been or overall theme is that Oregon is generally has a lot of challenges related to homelessness. And that's generally across like veterans, those that are chronically homeless. So those that are been living outdoor, have a disability and have been living unsheltered for over the last year, or have had a lot of off and on homelessness over the last few years. We have really high counts there. And then also, unfortunately, children and families is also really high in the state of Oregon as well, just generally. Next slide, please. So just a little bit more on that. So, you know, one of the perceptions is that a lot of homelessness is really centered in the Portland metro area, which we know that the Portland metro area definitely has really high rates of homelessness, but really it's just a quarter of the whole state as far as people experiencing homelessness. So it's really an issue across all of Oregon, all four corners of Oregon, as you all know. And that it shows here that there's an estimate that overall homelessness increased by about 19% over a 4-year period. And then also, this is true nationally, that people of color are overrepresented in the number of people experiencing homelessness. So just an example of that is African Americans make up just under 2% of the population in Oregon, but represent about 6% of those experiencing homelessness. And then Native Americans make up about 2% and represent 5% of people experiencing homelessness. So a lot of people are disproportionately impacted compared to other populations. Also, I'll just stop for a second and see if I saw a question in the inbox from Don Russ. Okay, I'm not sure if this is, so I think there's definitely this perception, I think, you know, really in lots of communities across the country and in Oregon as well, that a lot of people in their community that are experiencing homelessness are from somewhere else. And, you know, certainly people do migrate and move around. But I think that when people really dig into the data and the information, that really the vast majority of people experiencing homelessness are from their community. You know, may have went to elementary school, middle school, graduated high school. They're actually from that community. And so that's one thing that I think is oftentimes a misconception. And certainly it does happen, and people, you know, it's migratory, people are migratory and do move around, but generally the data shows that people are from that particular community. And yeah, but that does continue to be a perception. There's also this idea too, that people think that if they provide services that that people will flock there, and that they're going to be serving you know, people that aren't from their community. That's often in the homeless services world, that's oftentimes called like the magnetism myth. And so I think it's really important that every community has services for their for Oregonians. And so really, I think the hope, and we're seeing from the legislature and other things, and more resources going into affordable housing development, is that all cities and counties and communities have access to resources to be able to address the issue. I think that oftentimes the issue is not that people don't want to help their fellow Oregonians, it's that they don't have the resources or the know-how to do it. And it's really important that you're working, you know, braiding different resources from a city, federal government, from the state, and really getting creative about how you can create solutions. So, so that, yeah, that's my way, I think, to address that question. But I think some of the other items, I'm not as familiar with all the legislations that's happening, and what Ariel covered earlier was really informative for myself.
Yeah, we can definitely follow up on that piece. I want to make sure you get through your slides. We do want to move to the last point of our agenda.
Great. Yeah, if you could just keep moving through, that'd be great. Okay. So this is just, as I said earlier, every front door needs a back door. So it's really important to create affordable housing. And so these are just some of the resources that our agency distributes for that. And Ariel, keep going, or keep moving to the slides. Great. And so this is just a little bit about permanent supportive housing, which is essentially a proven best practice for people that are chronically homeless and are going to need a lot of support services to provide services on site. Next slide. Just a little bit of numbers. I think I've shared this before, but just sort of to show that during the Great Recession, there was not enough housing that was developed. And so part of the reason that we're sort of behind in our production is because there weren't units created during that time. Next slide. Okay, so this is a little bit about the eviction moratorium, renter protections, and rental assistance. So the eviction moratorium, HB 4401, lasts until June 30, 2021. All renters have to sign and return a form to their landlord. And so the form is available through those links. The Oregon Law Center has a lot of really good information. And then you all probably saw that Senate Bill 282, which is effective as of 2 days ago, extends the timeline. So renters will have to back pay their rent, but they will have until February 28th, 2022 to do so. Next slide. And then just 2 days ago, the Oregon Emergency Rental Assistance Program launched from our agency. This is a federal program through the US Treasury. And so across the entire state, we're receiving $282 million. So that includes a distribution to OHCS. And then there's also 6 local governments, 1 city and 5 counties that are also receiving a direct distribution. And so we're really excited. We have an online portal. So if you all know of folks in the community or want to help us get the word out, people can pay up to 12 months of back rent, utilities. And then once that is cleared, they will be able to pay up to 3 months of future months rental assistance as well. Next slide. And then just a little bit of some information related to the eviction moratorium that is up on our website, specifically some social media information. And then again, the Oregon Law Center's got a lot of really good information about the eviction moratorium as well. There. And there's my contact information. Yeah, you can always reach me, and if I can't answer your question, I can try to get someone within our agency or connect you with another community that may be able to help you out.
Thank you so much, Connor. It's really great information, a lot of really great links in these slides. I encourage everyone to go back when we send this out and click through those. We had a question in the chat that I'm wondering, Connor, if you can answer in the chat, because we do have to move on to our next part of the meeting. But questions about how you get an accurate point in time count. We know that the point in time count is an undercount. That's why it's really important. We wanted to share the other links to other data. The homeless student data from schools really shows a bigger picture, because we know that not everyone experiencing homelessness is reflected in that point in time count. Many people are doubled up living with friends and family. There's also a wealth of information at the Portland State University program where they're really digging into some really great data. And so you're going to want to look at how that, what the data is for your county, for your region, for your school district, and your local provider partners, housing service providers that Connor shared at the beginning are also really well versed in that data as well. And so I think they're a great resource to reach out to as you're understanding, who is experiencing homelessness in your community and how best to reach them. So Julie, if you can put up the last slide, I wanted to reserve the last little bit of time to talk about, what would be helpful to our LOC members going forward. I think we want to keep doing webinars, and as we move to reopening, we would love to come do some regional community meetings with you. We have an annual conference coming up that I'm sure we will have some focus on housing, some breakout sessions. So we've got a few Zoom poll questions built into the Zoom here that kind of get some ideas going. I'm going to ask Julie to start some polls, and we're going to just ask you a few questions about shelter and kind of what you're thinking in your communities. and then kind of move towards what resources, what questions do you have? What information would you like to see LOC focus on for members for programming going forward? So we're going to get that going. And then as you're answering these questions, if you have other ideas, things that don't fit the multiple choice, and I think you can select as many answers as you like, please put the questions in the chat. Please share ideas so that we can continue offering you this kind of information. So are we able to launch the polls, Julie?
I'm actually getting an error.
Oh, no.
You're logged in from another device. Your polling session is inactive.
Do I have to do it
Can
from my
you
end?
try?
You want me to try?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. It says relaunch polling. I'm going to relaunch it. Should I do that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. It looks like it's going. I hope, can people see that? Can someone tell me in the chat?
I think it's at the top, if you, there should be the 6 questions.
Yeah.
Select at the top.
You
It
should be
came
able to
up,
see questions.
came up on my screen.
Okay.
Perfect. All right. So go ahead and fill those out and quickly go through those. Thank you. I got to see another confirmation in the chat. So Julie, I'm not seeing, okay, I'm seeing our answers start to come in. There we go. All right, so keep filling those out. This is just to kind of, to get some information. Obviously, this is not a scientific study. So just wanted to get some thoughts from you, and then really want to hear, what kind of programming should we focus on going forward? Do you want more implementation help as we see bills pass? Do you want to learn from other cities or other cities in other states on different programming that they're doing? Do you want to focus on the resources? I mean, I think one of the key pieces about this, Connor shared a bunch of great information, and there's certainly more and more investments coming from the state and the federal government that are going to OHCS. But the vast majority of those resources, they don't come to local government unless you happen to have a community action agency or a housing authority established within your city or county, and there's only a couple of those. So my focus at the statewide level is really having cities have a stronger voice at the statewide level, stronger partners, and at the table about these resources. I want to work on getting information out to you after the funding is approved this session, so how much funding is coming to your communities, which provider partners that's flowing through, so that you can be, and I know many of you already are, but part of those conversations about what programs are being funded, where resources are going. What help would you like? What have you already got? Do you have a great example, a great story that you want to share with your other members? We can certainly set up kind of cohort, more member-led kind of webinars or meetings where you kind of talk about lessons learned, challenges you're experiencing, work through these issues together. We can set up those kinds of opportunities. If you have conference ideas, would love to hear them. So we have just a couple minutes left. I just want to encourage folks to put questions in the chat, and we will we'll put these out kind of like an FAQ in terms of like potential future discussions so that you can all see them if you have to jump. Great question about if anyone's had success working with ODOT to utilize right-of-way land. That's a great one. We could, potentially gather some people to talk about. We can invite ODOT. Want to hear, rural homelessness, how homelessness and housing needs, how does that look different than, I think a lot of times we see a lot of state policies can be influenced by the metro area. And so, how do we have a stronger voice and better articulate what we need to see coming to the smaller communities where it might look different, solutions might need to look a little bit different, right? Resources are different. We talked about fair housing. We have some partners from Fair Housing Council on today. I know that they're potentially pursuing a grant for more resources to partner directly with local communities on education and guidance. So I think that's something that we want to work with on them in the future if that opportunity comes up. I know that they've got regional staff around the state that are looking to work with jurisdictions. Great comment from Councilor Napak and Corvallis. Would like LOC to look at how to promote social service agency capabilities and coordination. That's definitely a need and a priority that OHCS has heard and the state is focused on, which is increasing the capacity of our provider network around the state. And I think that cities definitely have an opportunity to help with that, whether you're helping as fiscal partners to help with that, with tracking, or also just helping connect the dots as local partners. So definitely happy to be part of that conversation. Liability is a concern, absolutely. So maybe a challenge or a concern if cities are wanting to step up and to get more involved in shelter operations is what is the liability involved in that, and so how can we look into alleviating that. Some great contact information from Charlotte Reuter, who's the Education and Outreach Director at Fair Housing. Please feel free to contact them. We'll get all this information out to you in one place, or it's here in the chat. And I will just say, I think we're probably losing folks. So I just want to thank everyone for joining us. Please feel free to reach out to me anytime if I can help you connect with anyone, if you have questions, information, and we will continue to work on getting out more programming and information for you. Question is how to help your community get behind a homeless program. I think, one of the roles I really see for cities, you may not have resources, but, funding to directly contribute, but, your roles as city leaders in supporting productive community conversations about understanding the need, connecting to the data about who, your community members experiencing homelessness, and, how the community can respond. Worker jobs programs. I think that's another great role for cities to play, and it sounds like we've got some interest there. So we will add all of these to the list. And I, again, encourage any of you to reach out to me anytime with ideas as we start to plan our conference, our annual conference, and as we start to think about some other specific outreach and events for you. So thanks, everyone. I'll stay on for a few more minutes if folks want to continue putting thoughts in the chat, or if you want to raise a hand, I'm happy to chat, but the official programming is over, and we'll hope to catch you next time. So thanks again for attending, everyone, and big thanks to Megan and Connor for presenting, our partners.